I'm Jennifer Yoko. Hi. Road UCC, so I get around. Amen. And Tyler and I were talking about this theme of Refugia. Tyler, do you want to explain what Refugia is about?
Yeah. So if you think back, many of us in this room remember when Mount St. Helens erupted. And I remember I was at my grandparents' house in Almsville and standing on the back of my grandfather's truck and in the bed and looking over the neighbor's house, and it looked to me like a nuclear blast. I was 10 years old. I was a member of the generation that did duck and cover and thought we were going to all die in a nuclear holocaust. I couldn't understand why people around me were not more terrified. What was your memory?
I was camping. I was at Cottage Grove at Dorito Lake Reservoir, and we heard the eruption all the way down there, just this long little boom. And came back to Eugene, and our house and cars were all covered with ash. My dad took out a hose to rinse off the car, and everything turned to concrete.
Yeah. And Mount St. Helens lost 1,300 feet of elevation. It was completely covered in hot acidic ash, inches and inches and inches of hot acidic ash. And everybody, not just people like me who don't know anything, but like scientists, were saying it's going to be multiple human lifetimes before anything grows here. Nothing, like there's no way that anything can grow under this hot acidic ash. And within a few years, there was life on Mount St. Helens. 40 years later, it was teeming with life. It's not yet an old-growth forest. That is going to take hundreds of years. But it is teeming with life. And the reason for that is something that biologists now call refugia. It's a Latin word, so the singular is refugium. And a refugium is a pocket of life. Maybe it's a vole's nest way down deep, or a little bit of pearly everlasting, or maybe it's a bit of moss underneath one of those huge trees that got knocked over by the blast. But a place where life can exist and from which life can grow. And I learned about Refugia in the book by Deborah Reinstra called Refugia Faith. And in that book, she calls on us as the church to be refugia. She says that we have been called throughout time to be places of life and love in the midst of dangerous times.
And so, as we look at Refugia as it exists in this idea of the metaphor of the church, though, Tyler and I got a chance to talk about what our kind of go-to images of Refugia in nature are.
You want me to go first? So mine is this stump. This is actually Camp Adams. And this is a tree that has fallen over. And, you know, when, so one of the things that terrifies me, I will say, about the world that we live in is that our western red cedars are dying. And at Camp Adams, our western red cedars are dying. And when they die and fall over, the forester who helps us manage the forest, in the part that we can do something, most of the forest is preserved, says we need to plant trees from southern Oregon. We need to plant cedars from southern Oregon and from northern California because those might be able to survive in the climate we're going to have 50 years from now. But when one of those trees falls over and dies, it's not dead. Like there's nothing dead about it. And it becomes this amazing, if it's allowed to lie there, it becomes this nursery log with mushrooms and beetles and mosses and all kinds of life teeming in it, in this thing that we said, oh, that cedar tree died.
And my image, because I live in Florence on the Oregon coast, is an image of a tide pool area. And the tide pools are just amazingly violent places. When the waves come crashing in, this is actually from North Jetty at City Beach, and the waves come in just so violently there, and they bring the salt water and the cold and the wet, and then everything dries out and it gets hot and arid. But these critters have managed to adapt to live in this incredibly changeable violent environment and thrive. And so there has been that adaptation that makes life possible in this extremely inhospitable environment. And so Tyler and I were talking about, where does this happen in the Bible? Because, of course, it's happened in the Bible. And we were looking at the Babylonian exile. So we want to tell you a little bit about the story of the Babylonian exile and share some ideas from that. So we start with Nebuchadnezzar, which is one of the funnest words to spell. Nebuchadnezzar II. Incredibly powerful king of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar was a real estate magnate. He was all about the buildings. Of course, not with his own hands, because that would put calluses on them. But he wanted to build things. And he built the Great Wall around Babylon. And he had 15 million bricks made for his building projects. And on almost every single one of those bricks was stamped in cuneiform, I am Nebuchadnezzar, king. Do you think or you know of anybody else who loves to put his name on buildings? And so Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, he became very rich and very powerful. And of course, when one person becomes very rich and very powerful, they apparently want to become more rich and powerful. And so he reached out and he conquered Egypt. And then he looked a little bit closer to home, not too close, but still a little closer to home. He looked at the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. And he knew, because his spies, his emissaries, his ambassadors, he knew that there was great wealth in the temple there. And so he led a siege against Judah, lasted 30 months, 2.5 years. And he laid siege, and by the time he finally conquered Judah, this man who had built or caused to be made 15 million bricks, he took apart Solomon's temple brick by brick. And so that no stone was left standing at that temple. But even more devastating than taking apart God's own home, which is what taking apart the temple meant. He had anybody who had any skill, anybody who had any talent, anybody who had any wealth, anybody who had more than 3 brain cells to run together, he had them exiled, exported into Babylon. And what was amazing is that at this time, there were kind of designated prophets to the king, advisors to the king. And the advisors to the king of Judah at the time said, don't worry, this is going to last a year, maybe 2. And then everyone will come back and everything will be restored. But there was one prophet who said no. Jeremiah. Jeremiah, who said, plant your gardens. He said, take wives and marry. Have families. We are going to be here a while, folks. And what do? Your temple has been destroyed. You are being told you are never in your own lifetime probably going to go back home again. But what the people did is they created a refugium in their own scriptures. And in the time that they were in Babylon, that's when all the priestly voices get added to the Torah. That's when most of the book of Psalms gets written. It's where the prophet Jeremiah's whole book gets written. It's where the people of Judah become Jewish. not in that land that was their homeland, but in Babylon. That's where they defined themselves. That's where they delved into the refugia of their faith and became Jewish, having realized that God no longer lived in the temple, but that God was alive in their scriptures, in their traditions, in their songs, and in their stories.
I've been thinking about another refugium that existed at the same time. You see, in the story, the way that you told it, everybody who had 3 brain cells left. But there are people who were still there. And those people kept the traditions alive. They kept the Torah. They kept a version of the Torah. And they built a refugium in the land where they were a remnant. When it felt like everyone had abandoned them and there was nothing left, they held on to their faith. They held on to their God. And today, those people still live in Israel and Palestine. The Samaritans, who worshipped in a different way and said, we still have the texts. And one of the things that happened was that when these 2 different refugiums came together years later, and I was reading Nehemiah and Ezra this week, there was conflict. And one of the things that I think sometimes happens in moments like this is that we decide that your refugium is not as good as my refugium. I know that what really matters right now is the lives of queer people.
Yes.
And I know, Vicki, that you care about Somos Inmigrantes, that project, but that's not what really matters. And then we end up fighting with each other about the life that we've created, about the refugia that God has inspired in the world, instead of letting the different refugia be. Because we need Pearly Everlasting, and we need voles, and we also need moss.
Yes.
If we are going to have the future that we want.
And part of
To share?
we can share.
I can get
Part of becoming the future that we want is recognizing the fear that so many of us are living in. Friends, are you afraid these days?
Yeah.
Afraid for people that you love?
Yeah.
Afraid for yourselves? Are you afraid of losing health care and Social Security and your rural hospitals? Are you afraid for your family members or yourselves winding up in concentration camps? I have a grandson who's trans. I have so much fear for him. And that fearfulness has so infected my home and my community. I was, the stakes are so high. I, for the last year, served the ELCA Lutheran Church in Florence. And in July, I was having a conversation with them about continuing my contract to serve as their bridge pastor. And Lord knows I'm not Lutheran, but I was trying. So in this meeting we were sitting around the table, some of the folks were talking about, could you wear even more robes? And could you make sure that you put the cloth over the top of the communion bread, because it's really upsetting me that you don't do that. All right, that's easy. And then they said, could you stop praying or preaching about trans people and immigrants? Could you stop praying for them? And I said, just a second. Just a second. Are you specifically asking me to stop praying for trans people and immigrant people? And they said, yeah, just pray for everybody. And Dina, you got a t-shirt you're wearing? Yeah, what's your t-shirt say?
Resisting evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves.
Do you know what that is? That's the first baptismal promise. The first baptismal promise, every Christian, no matter what denomination, that's the first baptismal promise. I promise I will resist evil, injustice, and oppression, no matter how it expresses itself. And so I sat at a table and I said, I can't be your pastor anymore. Those are hard words to say. But the refuge that I have is my baptismal promise. The refuge that I have is these scriptures. The refuge that I have is a God that does not abandon us in times of desolation and despair. The refugium that I have is the church. Amen? Yes. Tyler, where's your refugium?
So, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that in this moment, I absolutely, 100%, with everything in my being, believe that people who choose the side of selfishness fail. That in a culture that worships selfishness, in a country with a cult of selfishness that says if things are dangerous, then be more selfish. That's what will get you through. Just be more selfish. Selfishness leads to more loneliness. It leads to withering. It leads to death. But that those who are willing in dangerous moments to side with love, and Bishop Michael Curry in his book, Love is the Way, says that selfishness is the opposite of love. That we think that hate is the opposite of love, but it's actually selfishness. Those who side with love, when you side with love, it leads to more companionship. It leads to more thriving. It leads to more life. And so I absolutely believe that this valley of the shadow of death will end. That there is green pasture on the other side. I also know that we have to get as many people through the valley as possible. And so for me, where I find refugia is in those places where we are loving the people who are closest to us. Right? My husband, who doesn't really want to have anything to do with the church because of how we were treated by our church in New Mexico, and is still a refugia, a place of life and love in the world. After the election, he found someone who was seeking asylum from Venezuela, assigned male at birth, so exactly the kind of people that Trump is most targeting, like men from Venezuela. That was the 200 people who were sent to the torture prison in El Salvador. And he has been walking alongside, I'm not going to say helping, walking alongside this person as they try to navigate the asylum structures and asylum systems. That is a place of refugia. I also think about, you talked about the exile and about Jeremiah and all the things that Jeremiah wrote in Babylon. I've been thinking a lot this week about Ebed-Melech. Ebed-Melech was an Ethiopian eunuch living in Jerusalem at a time when no one in Jerusalem believed that Jeremiah was a prophet. And the leaders of the city took Jeremiah and threw him in a well to die. And no one believed that he was a prophet. And Ebed-Melech, one person, went and pulled him out of the well. And then Jeremiah went on to write all of these things in Babylon. And that, for me, is where I find my greatest hope at this moment, is in our local churches who are just helping the people that are closest to them. In the people who aren't in local churches, who are just helping the people who are closest to them. Because those are refugium.
Those are refugium. We are refugium. We are building refugia. This time that we spend together, it's important for us to acknowledge the catastrophe that we are living through. And important to acknowledge that we, by joining hearts and hands, brick by brick, build new homes for God in our midst.